All right, everybody, what's going on? And welcome to today's edition of SWAC Talk. This is a show we cover the SWAC inside and out. I'm your tour guide around the SWAC, C. Wells, coming at you. And we're going to continue this little series that we've been doing since the summertime started, I guess you could say. When we talk about the leading returning players in the conference. So today we're going to talk about the leading defenders returning in the conference. That's the leading tackler for each team, the leader in tackles for loss, leader in sacks, leaders in interceptions for each team. And we'll have one more of these as we talk about special teams. We'll probably do that one on Wednesday. And then on Thursday is SWAC Smoke, episode number 150. You know, we like to have a little extra fun on every 50, 100, whatever, you know what I'm saying? So 150 is like a special thing for us. You know, just getting to that point is always just a blessing. So, you know, we're going to have a little fun with that. Media Day coming on the 16th. So we're going to probably do a little something. I'm probably going to do a preview on Sunday for that. And then, you know, I mean, if that's your thing, you know, the college football game is dropping in 10 days. So, of course, I'm going to have I might even do a little review when it come out. And, you know, we're going to be doing some things. My boy, Big Soldier Jamie G, working on a project for the game. So if you want to get in on that, hit him up or you know, hit us up on the social. SWAC Talk is the Facebook, Instagram, and SWAC Talk, Twitter, SWAC Talk 76. Don't forget to like the video, share it, and comment, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already, man. Like I said, I thank you everybody for subscribing already, and I thank you for subscribing in advance. So let's go ahead and jump into this. This is an interesting list, man. There's a lot of guys coming back who are really top-notch guys on the defensive side of the ball. There are some big names coming back. There are going to be some new faces, but I think more on in the secondary, you're going to have a lot of newer guys. So that's where you really are going to see some names that may not be where you expect them to be at the end of the season. So we're gonna start off with the Bulldogs of Alabama A&M. But first, before we do that, I'm gonna like I always say, this list is about guys who are returning to their team. So a guy that transferred somewhere, I wouldn't necessarily consider him the leading returning guy because he didn't play there before, but I have to take a minute to recognize Rico Dozier. He transferred from Pine Bluff to Bama State. He was the conference's leading tackler last season with 125 tackles, almost 11 and a half tackles per game. He also had 2 sacks on the season. That's heavy production. Like I said, that's the top guy coming. That's the top guy in the conference. A guy who could potentially be the conference player of the year on defense, but you know, he's going to a new team this year. So I can't put him on Pine Bluff for this list. I can't put him on Bama State for this list, but I got to recognize him when you have over 125 tackles on the season, including 62 assisted tackles and 63 solo tackles. You have to recognize a guy like that and show him love. So he is the top guy on Bama State defense right now, but he's not the top returning guy on their defense. So I really wanted to recognize that. I didn't want to overlook him. And I think he has a great case for Defensive Player of the Year in the preseason, although he is not the guy that I would pick. I'll share my thought on my guy as I get down the list. But we'll start off with the Bulldogs of Alabama A&M. And defensively, this team this was a team defensively that kind of was all over the place. Last season they were 8th in scoring defense at 27.4 points per game. Total defense, they finished 6th at 346 and a half yards per game. They allowed 5.5 yards per play. Their rushing defense was 6th at 142 yards per game. They averaged 3.9 yards per carry. The opponents did, and then their passing defense was eighth at 204 yards per game, allowed opponents completed 55% of their passes. They had 16 touchdowns and 11 interceptions, and they also registered 21 sacks as a defense. That was ninth in the league. So as you can see, this was a defense that was kind of in the lower portions of the rankings. And they return Marvin Smith. That's the leading returning tackler. He had 62 tackles on the season. Jamarion Ellis had 6 tackles for loss and 2.5 sacks to lead the defense. And Caleb Dawson is the leading guy in the second in terms of interceptions with 3. So they, that defense really could still stand to improve some. They were kind of a defense that didn't match the production of their offense, and that's probably the biggest reason that you can see this team not finish any higher than they did at any point in the season. This is going to be a team that's going to be a solid team. But they return some pretty capable guys, and we'll see how they do. They're moving on to Bama State. Like I said, Rico Dozier is the top guy on that defense, at least in terms of statistically last season, but he didn't play there, so I don't want to put him as the top returning guy. But Bama State, defensively, they were 6th in the league in sacks. By their defense, which is kind of a surprise for their defense to be where they were, but they had 25 sacks as a defense. Passing wise, their defense was 3rd at 186 yards per game. They only allowed 10 touchdowns on the season, which was the second fewest in the conference. And they finished the season with 11 interceptions, which tied for 5th place as a defense. The rushing defense was 2nd at 100 yards per game. They only allowed 8 touchdowns on the ground, which was 1st in the league. They allowed 3.2 yards per carry, which was 2nd in the league. And like I said, they allowed barely 100 yards on the ground. Total defense, they were 2nd at 281 yards per game, 4.5 yards per play, 18 touchdowns allowed. That was the fewest by far. They had 7 fewer touchdowns than the 2nd place team. And scoring defense, they led the league at 14.5 points per game. So this was a very good defense. Great is an even better word. You're losing a key guy in Bubba Adams, but you're returning some serious talent on this defense. The secondary is going to take some hits, but you're returning DeMarcus Cunningham, who had 82 tackles last season. Traquan Thomas is another guy who had 12 tackles for loss and 7 sacks on the season. So he definitely is a guy who can be a big factor on this defense. Cunningham actually was, Thomas actually tied for 4th in the league in sacks. So he was definitely a guy who really could produce some serious numbers with pass rushing. And then interceptions, they were led by Amon Scarborough with 2. So that defense is gonna be just as good as they were last season. I don't think it's gonna be a lot of drop off. And like I said, you add in a guy like Rico Dozier to that defense, is gonna just make them even more better. Moving on to Alcorn, this was a defense who again was a really solid defense. They finished the season 4th in total defense at 4th in scoring defense at 22.5 points per game. Total defense, they were 9th at 339 yards per game, allowed 5.5 yards per play. Their rushing defense was 6th at 140.6 yards per game, yards per game, average 4.2 yards per carry. Passing defense, they were 3rd at 199 yards per game, allowed 14 touchdowns with 15 interceptions. And defense and sacks, they were 2nd in the league with 30 sacks as a defense. And they return their top guy in terms of pass rush and pressure, and that's Malachi Bailey, 15.5 tackles for loss and 9 sacks. Also had 2 interceptions on the season. I mean, excuse me, that was also he had 9 sacks, which led the league. So you're looking at a guy who really was a very, very productive, um, very, very productive guy on that defense, and that makes them that much better. Their leading returning tackler is Edwin Summerall. He has 63 tackles on the season and also 2 interceptions. So this defense should be as steady as they were. You would love to see some improvement on some numbers, but Alcorn generating pressure on quarterbacks makes that defense that much better. Forcing turnovers makes that defense that much better. And I like where they stand right now. One of the surprising teams on defense last season was Bethune-Cookman. In 22, their defense was horrendous. Last season, their defense finished 6th at 26 points per game. They were 8th in total defense at 377 yards per game, allowing 5.8 yards per play. They allowed 33 touchdowns, which was 5th in the league. So they weren't that bad, allowing teams to get in the end zone. Rushing defense, they were 9th at 168 yards per game, allowed 4.5 yards per carry. Passing defense, they were 7th at 209.5 yards per game. The opponents completed 60% of their passes. They only allowed 8 touchdowns as a defense through the air, and that led the conference. And they finished with 9 interceptions. And they generated 22 sacks as a defense. So this defense, when you look at those numbers, a lot of those numbers are like, 5th place, 6th place, 7th place, 8th place. But for where that team was in previous season, and what they lost, and just filling in so many new guys on their defense last season, I think they played fairly well. Now there's a lot of hype on Bethune-Cookman this season, but they are gonna have some holes to fill. Darius Thomas is the leading tackler. He is gonna be one of the top guys on that defense and one of the top guys in the conference. He had 97 tackles. Adrian Hall finished with 3 sacks. Thomas also had 12.5 tackles for loss. And the secondary, like I said, it didn't generate a lot of turnovers, but Darnell Dees is one of a few guys with 1 interception piece returning. So we're gonna see where this team is. Like I said, I think they're gonna be every year. There's a team that everybody, that a lot of people really generate a lot of hype and attention to. And right now, I see Bethune-Cookman kind of bubbling that up under the surface right now. So they're kind of like the hot darling for the summer. So we'll see, how they turn out. But I wouldn't be surprised to see them get a little bit more attention from other people. I think they're gonna be in the mix of finishing the top half of the division. I'm not sure if they can get there because I still think they have a lot of questions on the other side of the ball. But right now, I think the defense was underrated by a lot of people, and I would love to see that defense continue to grow. Next up is FAMU, and FAMU was, if not the top of defense in the conference, they were number 2, 1 or 2 in most categories. They were 2nd in scoring defense at 15.2 points per game. Passing defense, total defense, they were at 261. That's not right. I hit the wrong. Total defense, they led the league at 261 yards per game. They allowed 25 touchdowns on the season, and they allowed opponents to average 4.2 yards per play. So, like I say, one of the top defenses in the league. Rushing defense, they were 1st at 95.4 yards per game. They only allowed 2.9 yards per carry, and their passing defense was 1st at 165 yards per game. They gave up 14 touchdowns. They had 17 interceptions. Out of 17 interceptions, tied for the league lead, and they led the league in sacks at 37. So that dark cloud defense, it was very, very good. Made a lot of plays when they needed to, and I think that defense is going to continue to carry them. They did have some big losses on that defense, but I think with the guys they're returning plus some of the newer guys, I think their defense is going to be still solid. Deco Wilson is the leading returning tackler with 39. He also had 3 interceptions. James Ash led the team in returning production with 6 tackles for loss. And Alan Smith Jr. has 3.5 sacks returning. They have a lot of guys that are gonna be playmakers on this defense, and that's one of the reasons why I'm hesitant to really knock them too much. If you don't really feel that way about FAMU, and you think they lost too much, and losing Willie Simmons is a big loss. If you feel like they lost too much, I can understand that. I'm just one of those people who at least before anything really gets popping, I feel like the champ is the champ until they get beat. So I'm gonna always give, no matter who it is, I'm gonna always give the champ at least a little bit of leeway. Sometimes I might give more than other times, but I'm human, so hey. But next up is Grambling. And Grambling lost some key guys on their defense. They lost Sunday Anderson and Lewis Matthews, 2 of the top guys on that defense. Their leading returning tackler is Kevin Thomas. He had 42 tackles. He also had 2 interceptions. Andrew Jones is the leading guy in tackles for loss, returning with 3. And I had to go down the list pretty far to find a guy for sacks, and Josh Darling was the guy that I found. He had 1 sack. Grambling's defense as a whole generated 23 sacks on the season. That was 7th in the league. Their passing defense was 4th at 181 yards per game, 19 touchdowns, 14 interceptions. The opponents completed 55% of their passes, which was 2nd in the league behind FAMU. Their rushing defense was 175.6 yards per game. That was 8th in the league. They also allowed 4.5 yards per carry. Total defense, they ranked 7th at 356 yards per game, 5.5 yards per play. And their scoring defense was 9th at 28.5 points per game. So, like I said, their defense is losing some key guys, but they do have some guys coming in, and there's a few returning guys who have had some solid production. But the top guys are no longer there, so that's always something to kind of look at. Jackson State is next on our list, and they finished the season. They finished the season 5th in scoring defense at 23.9 points per game. Total defense, they were 4th at 335 yards per game, 5.4 yards per play. Rushing defense, they were 10th at 148 yards per game. So their defense kind of has some problems on the ground, 4.6 yards per carry. Wait, that's not. Let me flip this. All right, their defense was 7th in rushing defense at 148 yards per game, 4.6 yards per play on the ground. Their passing defense was 4th at 187 yards per game, 16 touchdowns allowed, 17 interceptions, tied with FAMU for the lead. And defensively, they generated 29 sacks, which was tied for 3rd in the league. So still a really solid defense, not necessarily, where they were the previous 2 years, but still a really solid defense. And, they're only going to continue to get better. Sayers Guthrie led the defense in terms of returning production with 52 tackles. True Thompson had 3.5 sacks. Philip Webb, 6 tackles for loss, and BJ Washington with 3 interceptions. So this defense should really be still solid. Moving on to the Delta Devils. Their defense, honestly, you put it nicely, they leave a lot to be desired. They finished the season with 12 sacks as a whole on the season. Their passing defense was 10th at 210 yards per game. They gave up 20 touchdowns, only 7 interceptions. That was the 2nd fewest interceptions on the season. Opponents completed 66% of their passes, which was one of the worst numbers in the league. Their rushing defense was 9th at 171 yards per game, gave up 5.2 yards per carry. Their total defense They ranked 10th at 381 yards per game, 6.2 yards per play, and their scoring defense was at 27 points per game, and that was 7. So allowing points was not the problem for Valley, which is something that you typically don't see. You typically see Valley defense give up a great bit of points, but they really did get whole teams to decent numbers um, on the defense, but the offense couldn't really generate much. Ryan Quinney leads the team with 59 tackles, 9 tackles for loss, and 2.5 sacks. He's a guy who I think could be a name that you would want to look out for. Jaron Fox, he transferred to FAMU. He was one of the top guys that they lost. So there's going to be some opportunities for guys. They're, Valley's recruiting fairly well, bringing in some guys that can contribute. But we'll see if they can get it done. Eric Campbell is one of the returning guys with 1 interception on that defense. But still, defensively, they weren't as bad as they normally are. But they just still couldn't overcome what their offense was. Next is Prairie View. They finished 10th in scoring defense at 31.2 points per game. They were 11th in total defense at 396 yards per game. Rushing defense, they were 5th at 141 yards per game, 4.3 yards per play. Passing defense, they were last in yards per game at 254. They were 27 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. And sacks, they finished 10th at 19. Now this defense, some of those numbers are because of those the FBS games and those non-conference games that they just did not play well in. They played fairly well, from the late portions of the season. But when they did not play well, they just did not play well. I don't think the defense is necessarily as bad as those numbers look as a whole, but I think they just, they had some really bad games. And, when you have really bad games, it's not much you can do. But CJ Presley, he is the returning tackler with 54. Jamal Marshall leads the team with 7.5 tackles for loss and 3.5 sacks. And Warren Shankle is one of the guys returning with an interception. But there's a lot of promise for this defense. There's a lot of new faces going to be on this defense. These guys who are returning, they're gonna have to step up to the plate and really buckle down and get some of these numbers back to where they should be. Next is Southern. Southern was tied for 3rd in the league with 29 sacks as a defense. Passing defense, they finished 5th at 196 yards per game. Gave up 13 touchdowns, only 7 interceptions. Southern defense really didn't get a lot of turnovers as a whole, but they to be in the position that they were put in by their offense so much last season, I thought their defense still played fairly well, but they didn't generate a lot of interceptions. Opponents completed 60% of their passes against them. Rushing defense, they were pretty solid until the later portions of the season, where they started to get gashed on the ground. But they still finished 3rd with in yards per game with 131, and they still only allowed 3.4 yards per carry, which was also 3rd. So, and 12 touchdowns, which was 3rd as well. So that defense, despite getting gashed by Ladarius Owens and getting gashed by Chance Williams and Floyd Chalk, and getting towed by Alcorn, I thought their defense on the ground really played fairly well for most portions of the season. Gave up big plays here and there, but still, when you look at it that way, they still turned out fairly well, even though they did have some bad games toward the end of the season. They finished 3rd in total defense at 327 yards per game. 25 touchdowns allowed, 4.7 yards per play. That number was 3rd as well in the conference. And then scoring defense, they were 3rd at 20.3 points per game. Didn't really give up a lot of points, as you can look at those numbers. That Alcorn game really kind of kind of blew that number out of the water. Giving up over 40 points really changed that. But Derek Williams is their leading tackler, returning. He led the team last season with 67 tackles. He went back and forth with Jalen Campbell for the lead. I think Campbell got hurt and missed one game. Williams ended up taking the lead with 67 tackles. Kelby Givens leads the team with 21 tackles for loss. That number led the conference last season. So he's the leading returning guy in the conference with 21 tackles for loss, average 1.9 tackles for loss per game. He also has 7 sacks, which is tied for fourth. So he's one of the top defensive linemen returning in the conference. He's one of the top pass rushers in the conference. And so, having 2 of your top guys in production returning definitely helps this defense. Horatio Johnson is one of the guys coming back with 1 interception on the season. And like I said, they only had 7, so there's not a lot of interceptions to be spread around. But Southern has some solid foundational pieces. They still have some holes to fill, but you have to feel good if you're a Southern fan about, the guys that you have returning. Next up is Texas Southern. Defensively, this team allowed 32.7 points per game, which was 11th. Total defense, they were 9th at 37.9 yards per game, 5.2 yards per play. Rushing defense, they were 11th at 176 yards per game, 4.1 yards per carry. Passing offense, passing defense, they were 6th at 203 yards per. Let me fix it. They were 7th at 203 yards per game, 18 touchdowns, only 5 interceptions, 55% completion rate for the opponents. Defensively on sacks, they were 5th with 26. They returned the guy that I would pick as the preseason defensive player of the year. That's Jacob Williams. 106 tackles on the season, 18.5 tackles for loss, 8 sacks. Just a guy who is totally disruptive all over the field. I think that he didn't really get the attention that he deserved last season. But he had a great season last season. I think he'll do the same this year. And that's my pick for the conference defensive player of the year in the preseason. Javis Williams is the leading returning interception guy with 1 among others. But this defense, had their moments. I think lack of depth really killed this defense. And they have some individual talent, but they don't have a lot of numbers. And so even though you have probably one of the top guys in the conference coming back, it makes it tough to really see where they stand. But Jacob Williams is that guy that I would put my vote behind if I had one. Last up is Pine Bluff. This was a defense that finished the season with 18 sacks, which was 11th. Passing defense, they were 11th as well at 250 yards per game, 23 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. Those 4 interceptions were the fewest in the league. Opponents completed 66% of their passes, which also was the worst in the league. Rushing defense, they were last at 194 yards per game, 5.1 yards per carry. Allowed, that was 11th in the league. 21 touchdowns, like I said. Total defense, they were last at 444 yards per game, 6.7 yards per play. That was the worst in the league. 44 touchdowns, tied for the league worst. And then scoring defense, they finished last at 33.8 points per game. So this was just, this was it was rough for Pine Bluff on both sides of the ball. But defensively, they really had their struggles. Injuries wrecked this team on both sides. And then, you had a guy like Rico Dozier on this defense. And, one guy is not going to make a defense. But, you still didn't get a lot of production from other people. You had some guys like Lukeman, one of their top D linemen, get injured earlier in the season. That kind of hurt. But Khalil Arnold leads the team in tackles with 40, tackles for loss 7.5, and 4 sacks. He's probably going to be the main piece for that defense moving forward, along with Lukeman. And Kyle Knox had one of those 4 interceptions for their defense. So not a lot to be, not a lot to really, hang your hat on if you Pine Bluff. So it's kind of best to kind of, start over and, just kind of go from there. But that's pretty much where we stand with the leading returning guys. Like I said, there's still some star power coming back, but there's a lot of new guys are gonna take that step from 3rd or 4th leading tackler on the team to leading tackler. Guys who had some production but didn't really show out, whether it was through the fact that there are other people in front of them or just not a lot of opportunities. There's gonna be some guys step up. But I do feel like there's a lot of solid guys returning, but not a lot of star power. So with that being said, man, I'm your tour guide around the SWAC Seawells coming at you, and I'm signing out, and I will catch y'all on the rebound. Peace.